Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. And also, the Search for the Ancient Bauble Kickstarter has launched, so make sure you go check that out. The Kickstarter campaign will last for 30 days, and after that, the playmat will no longer be available for purchase. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, Modern Horizons 2 spoiler season continues on, and yesterday we got some really exciting spoilers, including a brand new Squirrel Tribal Commander with Chatterfang. Now, if you haven't seen my episode yet on that Squirrel Tribal Commander that everyone's been waiting on, make sure you check it out, but not before you watch this episode because that would be rude to leave. And I would know and I would get sad. Also, don't leave to watch my other episode on the Omniscience Coin Flip Commander, Yusri Fortune's Flame. But still go watch that one at some point, as well as Chatterfang in whatever order you please. Just please don't leave this one yet. Because on this episode, I'm going to be talking about the newest sword that was spoiled. That's right, the sword cycle is getting closer and closer to completion with the reveal of the Sword of Hearth and Home. Now, what exactly does this sword do, and is it one of the most powerful ones of the cycle? Well, let's jump into it to find out. So first off, a big thank you to MTG Goldfish for this translation. The Sword of Hearth and Home is an artifact equipment that costs 3 and it costs 2 to equip. Like the other swords in the cycle, it gives +2/+2 in protection from 2 colors, and in this case those are green and white. On top of that, it says, whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own and search your library for a basic land card. Put both cards onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. So, like the other swords, you get a combat trigger from hitting a player, and you get 2 benefits based on the colors of the sword. Or maybe I should say the colors of protection granted from the sword. Now, how exactly does this sword stack up to the others? The swords see varying levels of use in Commander, with some seeing a decent amount and others not so much. Also, these swords tend to be decently expensive, which might limit their use. Regardless, let's first dissect this sword specifically, and then we'll jump into the others for comparison's sake. All of them cost the exact same amount and the exact same amount to equip, and they also all get +2/+2, so there are no differences there clearly. Now, when it comes to granting protection from green and white, there are better color combinations out there, but it's not the worst. This protects you from Beasts Within, Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, etc., etc. There aren't many green removal spells for creatures, but there are plenty in white. So not only is that some good protection, but it can also get you through on a decent amount of opponents as well with their green and white creatures. Now when it comes to that combat trigger, you're basically blinking a creature and ramping, both of which can generate you a lot of value throughout the game. Ramping, of course, is one of the most important things in Commander, so of course getting an extra land each turn can be huge. And there are plenty of creatures out there with powerful ETBs that you can use and abuse with this card. So this card not only has the potential to ramp you, but also to generate card advantage as well as other effects as well. Now, keep in mind that with that blink effect, there are a few factors to consider. It says up to 1 target creature you own, so you're not forced to do it. If you only have 1 creature on the field and it's the creature that's attached to this, you might not want to do that. Also, keep in mind that it does say you own, not control. So if an opponent stole one of your creatures, well, this can help you get it back. What it can't do, though, is blink a creature that you yourself stole. A small distinction, but just one to keep in mind. Again, ramping and card advantage are 2 of the most important things in Commander, and this can give you both. And keep in mind that when that creature and land come into play, they come into play untapped. So you can utilize that creature for a block if you need to, but more importantly, that land comes into play untapped so you can utilize it in your second main phase. Regardless, I do think that this sword has potential in Commander. Now, how much potential exactly? Well, let's find out by comparing this sword to the others in the cycle. Now, originally there were 5 swords that came out in the Mirrodin block quite a long time ago. They were the Sword of Fire and Ice, the Sword of War and Peace, the Sword of Feast and Famine, the Sword of Light and Shadow, and the Sword of Body and Mind. Each featured an enemy color pair for the protection that they granted. Then back in the original Modern Horizons, we got the Sword of Truth and Justice and the Sword of Sinew and Steel. Obviously, with the enemy color pairings completed, we got some allied colored pairings instead. Now, since there was only 2 in that set, the assumption was at some point the rest of these swords would be revealed. And obviously those assumptions were correct with the newly revealed Sword of Hearth and Home. Now, whether we see the remaining 2 swords in this set, or another one, or just one of them, or neither, who knows? For the time being, we've got the 8 swords, so let's compare them and see which are the most popular in Commander and where the Sword of Hearth and Home might fit. Now, when it comes to use in Commander, one sword stands above the rest, both in popularity and in price, with the Sword of Feast and Famine. According to GDH Rack, this $60 card sees playing over 17,000 decks. This sword grants protection from black and from green, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card and you untap all lands you control. There are a good amount of popular creature removal spells in black, so that's some decent protection. And forcing a player to discard a card is okay, but being able to untap all your lands on a hit is huge. This essentially doubles up the amount of mana that you've got access to on one of your turns. So yeah, that sword's gonna be really hard to beat in popularity. Consistent ramping is good, but being able to use your lands twice on your turn is, well, really impactful. You can get way ahead of your opponents and finish out the game very quickly. Next up in terms of popularity, there's Sword of Fire and Ice, which comes in around $45 and sees play in over 10,000 decks. This one grants protection from red and from blue, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, Sword of Fire and Ice deals 2 damage to any target and you draw a card. So protection from blue and red is pretty good, and also being able to ping something small down is nice as well, or just ping a player. But perhaps the best part of this card is the card advantage, which again is very important in Commander. Again, although our new sword doesn't technically provide card advantage, it can if you've got a creature that has an ETB that draws you a card or gets you a card back, etc, etc. Next up though, let's move on to our third most popular sword with one of the newer ones with Sword of Truth and Justice. This one is currently about $20 and sees play in around 10,000 decks. It gives protection from white and from blue, which is really good, and whenever a quick creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, then proliferate. Now, getting a +1/+1 counter on something is nice, but the key to this card is that proliferate effect. So if you've got a deck that focuses on proliferating and getting more counters on things, this can come in really big. So if you've got a Super Friends deck and want more loyalty counters or more charge counters on things, or yes, +1/+1 counters as well, that can really help out. So this one is more so good in specific decks and is not just generally good. Next up, we've got the other sword from the original Modern Horizons with the Sword of Sinew and Steel. Currently, this sword is around $10 and sees play in about 7,500 decks. This one grants protection from black and from red, and says whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, destroy up to 1 target planeswalker and up to 1 target artifact. Now, those effects can be very impactful, but more so impactful depending on your meta. Or I guess I should say that first part is destroying up to 1 target planeswalker. Typically, there are going to be artifacts around like mana rocks, etc, etc. So you can blow something up when you hit an opponent. But less typically, planeswalkers are actually going to be in play. So you easily could whiff with half the benefit that this gives. And because of that, it sees less play than some of the other swords that are more applicable in most situations. Speaking of which, next up let's talk about the Sword of Light and Shadow. Currently, this sword is around $20 and sees play in over 7,000 decks. The Sword of Light and Shadow gives protection from white and from black, and it says whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you gain 3 life and may return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This sword perhaps gives the best protection out of all of the swords. Many of the best creature removal spells out there in Commander are going to be either white or black. But to make up for that, its combat trigger can be, well, pretty underwhelming. Gaining 3 life really isn't all that great in Commander. Now, yes, there are certain commanders out there that have life gain synergies, but still. Now, that other part of the combat trigger can be very impactful, but again, like the previous sword, it can whiff. If you don't have any creatures in your graveyard, you're not getting anything back. Now, if you've got a specific type of deck where you're trying to get more creatures in your graveyard by either milling or sacrificing them, this can really help you. But it can also not help you if someone, say, exiles your graveyard. Then you've just got this sword that, well, gains you 3 life, which again isn't all that impactful. Next up though, let's move on to the Sword of War and Peace. This one is currently around $10 and sees play in about 5,000 decks. This sword gives protection from red and from white, and it says whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, Sword of War and Peace deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand, and you gain 1 life for each card in your hand. So this card can really punish players that keep a lot of cards in their hand. But again, the other side of that is life gain, which again isn't all that impactful. Now, unlike the Sword of Light and Shadow, which gives you 3 life, this is a variable amount. So if you've got a good amount of cards in your hand, congratulations, you just gained a bunch of life. But if you don't, well, then you gain nothing or very little. So while extra potential damage is nice, yeah, this one's not all that impactful in Commander. Or at least I should say in comparison to the other swords. But now let's move on to the least popular sword in Commander with the Sword of Body and Mind. This sword is currently around $12 and sees play in nearly 5,000 decks. This one grants protection from green and from blue, and it says whenever a equipped creature deals combination to a player, you create a 2/2 green wolf creature token, and that player mills 10 cards. Out of all the protection color combinations, this one might be the weakest, though that is definitely up to debate. What's not all that up to debate, though, is that its effects are pretty limited. A 2/2 wolf can be good for, say, a token deck, but yeah, it's not going to be all that impactful. And making a player mill 10 cards can be effective in a mill strategy, but not really in anything else. So yeah, there's a reason why this one is the least played sword. Now, after going through each of the swords, where exactly does the Sword of Hearth and Home end up? In my opinion, it's probably going to see play right around the amount of Sword of Fire and Ice. So it'd probably be either the second or third most popular sword. Just as the Sword of Fire and Ice gives you guaranteed card draw, you're getting guaranteed ramp with this new sword. And also that blink effect can be very impactful in a lot of decks out there. There are plenty of decks that utilize creatures with useful and incredibly impactful ETBs. Now I might be overrating that aspect of this sword, but that's just my initial quick take. And actually I might even be underrating this card a bit as well. I mean, a somewhat comparable card to this one is Sword of the Animist. Sword of the Animist sees play in 30,000 decks, which is nearly twice as much as the most popular sword. Though Sword of Feast and Famine is incredibly expensive, and Sword of the Animist is still decently expensive, but nowhere near. Regardless, Sword of the Animist costs 2 and 2 to equip, and it gives equipped creature +1/+1. And whenever equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. Now, this is guaranteed ramp on an attack. So, unlike our new sword, we don't have to actually hit the player to get the effect. That being said, this land comes into play untapped, whereas our swords does not. Also, this equipment doesn't grant any kind of protection, and it doesn't have any extra effect like that blink effect. Now, notably, this sword is 1 mana less than the other sword, which is impactful. But still, I really think that the use of this card shows the potential use of the Sword of Hearth and Home. The potential for continuous ramp is huge in a game of Commander. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is just my initial quick take, so I very much might be overrating or underrating this card. Regardless, let's talk about some commanders that might want to use a card like this. First up, let's talk about some commanders that are focused on equipment like Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale, Akiri, Fearless Voyager, and Shram, Senior Edificer. Sir Gwyn has equipment you control have equipped Knight 0. So essentially you can freely attach your equipment to this commander or another Knight you control, which is huge. Saving on all of your equipped costs makes Sir Gwyn or your other Knights incredibly deadly. On top of that, whenever equipped creature you control attacks, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So you're getting some extra card advantage as well for just a little life. Speaking of which, Akiri Fearless Voyager has whenever you attack a player with 1 or more equipped creatures, draw a card. And then by paying a white, you can unattach an equipment from a creature you control. If you do tap that creature, it gains indestructible until end of turn. So she's an equipment-focused commander that generates you card advantage for attacking and also can protect your creatures as well. But speaking of card advantage, perhaps the best of these is Shram, Senior Edificer. It has whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. So by running a ton of equipment in your deck, you're going to be drawing a lot of cards. And as I'm talking about equipment commanders, I of course have to bring up the adorable combination of Rograk, or I like to call Rog, and Arden. Rog is a simple 0/1 with First Strike, Menace, and Trample for 0 mana. Yeah, that's a thing. Anyways, then there's Arden, Intemperate Archaeologist, which is a 2/2 that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may attach any number of auras and equipment you control to target, permanent, or player. So you simply get Rog out, and then you attach all your equipment to it, and you have fun. So another sword on Rog could be a very impactful thing. Now, of course, like certain equipment commanders, you can also consider a Voltron-style commander like Zurgo, Rafika the Many, and Hope of Girapur. You suit them up this new sword so they're protected from certain spells, and they can more easily get through against certain creatures. And of course, on top of that, you're getting the benefits from when they do hit. Which leads us to Blink-style commanders like Yorion Sky Nomad, Rune of the Hidden Realm, and Amreth Illustrious. Again, when hitting, you get that blink effect, and commanders such as these really want to take advantage of a lot of blink effects in their deck. Yorion wants to blink basically every other one of your non-land permanents when it comes into play, so yeah, just blinking this blinks basically everything. And then Rune usually likes to blink more specific things with its own ability, but yeah, giving it an extra way to blink is fantastic. And then Amara says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield on your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's yours a card type of that permanent, you may reveal that card and put it in your hand. So additional card advantage is always a good thing. So you can get a lot of advantage throughout the game in decks like these. Of course, there are plenty of other commanders that might want to consider this sword, and two other ones that I just want to bring up are ones like Hearth the Desecrated and 8.5 Tails, though for different reasons. A lot of players like to build a landfall style deck around Hearth the Desecrated. It has if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, and that ability triggers initial time. So essentially with this in play, your landfall triggers trigger twice. So by hitting with this new sword, you get a land into play and gets you a lot of value out of this. And in this deck, you're also going to be utilizing a lot of creatures with some very powerful ETBs. So you can blink one of those creatures as well and get their ETB twice, which is especially impactful when you've got a creature that has an ETB that gets you a land, because that doubles, then the landfall triggers double, and you see where this is going. And then 8.5 Tails can be good with equipment that grant protection from white. It does have pay 1 in white, target permanent you control gains protection from white until end of turn. But not having to pay that every time can be very impactful. Because 8.5 Tails has pay 1, target spell or permanent becomes white until end of turn. So now with this new sword equipped to this commander, you just have to pay 1 mana to protect it instead of 3. Regardless, like I mentioned, there are probably a lot of commanders out there that can really consider a sword like this. But now it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on the Sword of Hearth and Home. Like I said earlier, this is just my initial quick take, and I really do keep going back and forth as to where I think this is actually going to fit. My gut is telling me it's going to end up somewhere around 2nd or 3rd place around the Sword of Fire and Ice. But again, with the comparison to Sword of the Animist, I could be very wrong because again, that one sees a ton of play. Rarely should you underestimate ramp in the game of Commander. Regardless, now that you've heard my thoughts on this card, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So in the comments below, let me know where you think it's going to land in popularity in comparison to the other swords. Will it be more popular than I think, or less popular than I'm thinking? Again, I keep going back and forth, so help me decide in the comments below. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.